The town of Redemption Gulch was a blister on the face of the earth, a place God had either forgotten or forsaken entirely. It squatted in a shallow basin of baked hard dirt, surrounded by skeletal hills the color of old bone. The sun was not a source of life here. It was a hammer, beating down from a mercilessly white sky, cracking the land and bleaching the hope from men's eyes. Dust was the town's only constant, a fine, gritty powder that coated everything: the sagging timbers of the buildings, the inside of a man's throat, the memories you tried to drink away. In the heart of this desolation stood the Gilded Cage Saloon, a name so steeped in irony it was almost a prayer. Inside, the air was thick enough to chew, a foul stew of stale whiskey, sweat, cheap cigar smoke, and the lingering scent of desperation. Drunken laughter, sharp and brittle, cracked against the low ceiling, mingling with the clumsy clatter of poker chips and the mournful groan of the floorboards. It was a symphony of despair played by tired men with hollow faces, all of them running from something, even if it was just the deafening silence of the plains. Clara May moved through this chaos like a ghost. At 27, she looked older, her youth worn away not by years but by inches, scraped off by the rough hands and rougher words of men who saw her as just another fixture, no different from the scarred bar or the spittoons in the corner. She was pale, her skin like milk where it was not bruised, and she kept her eyes downcast, fixed on the murky floor as if studying a map of her own private hell. Her hands, when they were not hidden, trembled as she poured whiskey, a slight, ceaseless tremor that betrayed the stillness she fought so hard to maintain. Beneath the long sleeves of her drab, patched dress, she hid the marks, purple and yellow landscapes of another man's anger, monuments to her own worthlessness. She filled a glass for a grimy prospector, her movements economical and silent. She had learned long ago that silence was a shield. Noise drew attention, and attention brought pain. So she made herself small, invisible, a phantom refilling glasses and clearing away empties, her presence barely registering until a man needed something. Her eyes, the color of a faded sky, were vacant, not because there was nothing in them, but because she had walled off whatever was left behind them. It was the only way to survive in the gilded cage. The batwing doors creaked open, groaning against the relentless afternoon glare. A sliver of blinding light cut through the gloom, and a man's silhouette filled the doorway. He was tall, broad in the shoulders but lean, as if the land itself had stripped him of anything unnecessary. He stood there for a moment, letting his eyes adjust, a patient stillness about him that was alien in this room of fidgeting, loud-talking men. This was Eli Cutter. His face was a testament to the sun and the wind, crisscrossed with fine lines and weathered to the color of worn leather. It was a hard face, but not cruel. It was unreadable, a calm mask, honed by long months on the trail with only cattle and the stars for company. He had just finished a drive, pushing a herd from the green plains of the north down to the railheads in the south, and he carried the scent of dust, leather, and distance with him. He was not looking for trouble, or company, or even a woman. He was looking for supplies, a hot meal that was not cooked over a campfire, and a few nights of silence before he turned his horse toward home. He moved to the bar, his stride long and easy, his spurs making a soft, rhythmic clinking that was swallowed by the saloon's din. He did not look at Clara, but at the array of dusty bottles behind her. "Whiskey," he said. His voice was low and quiet, yet it seemed to cut through the surrounding noise with effortless clarity. It was a voice that did not need to be loud to be heard. Clara nodded, her gaze fixed on the countertop. She took a glass, not one of the cheap, thick ones, but a cleaner one she kept aside, and poured him a measure. Her hand shook, just a little, as she set it before him. He laid a coin on the bar, enough for the drink and more, and still did not look at her. He took the glass and moved to a small, secluded table in the corner, turning his chair so his back was to the wall. He drank slowly, his eyes scanning the room with a practiced, dispassionate gaze, taking in everything and revealing nothing. He was a man who understood the geometry of a dangerous room. For an hour, the world continued its ugly spin. Clara served, wiped, and retreated into herself. Eli nursed his single glass of whiskey, his silence a solid, immovable object in the roiling sea of noise. He watched her. He saw the way she flinched when a man laughed too loud, the way she held her arms tight against her body, the almost imperceptible tremor in her hands. He had seen women like her before, in towns just like this one, broken by the world and trapped in places that profited from their pain. It was a story as old and as grim as the land itself. The trouble started, as it often did, with a man named Jedediah. He was a mule skinner with a mean streak widened by liquor, his face flushed and his eyes holding a belligerent glaze. He had been losing at cards, and he was looking for something weaker than himself to blame. His gaze fell on Clara as she passed his table. "Hey, girl," he slurred, his voice thick and ugly. "Another bottle over here, and be quick about it." Clara flinched at the tone but did not answer. She fetched the bottle and brought it to his table, setting it down gently. She tried to pull her hand back, but his shot out, grabbing her wrist in a grip like an iron band. His fingers dug into the tender flesh, pressing on a bruise she had gotten just the day before. A gasp of pain escaped her lips, small and sharp. "What's the hurry?" Jedediah sneered, his friends chuckling. "Sit a spell. Have a drink with a man who pays your keep." He started to pull her down onto his lap, his other hand moving to snake around her waist. Clara's body went rigid with a familiar, cold terror. "Please, sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Mr. Blackwood doesn't allow it." "I don't give a damn what Blackwood allows," he growled, tightening his grip. Her wrist felt like it might snap. "You'll do as you're told." The whole saloon seemed to hold its breath, the patrons watching with a mixture of amusement and indifference. This was just another Tuesday in Redemption Gulch. It was sport. From the corner, a chair scraped against the floor. Eli Cutter rose to his feet. He did not shout or draw his gun. He simply stood, a tall, quiet pillar of judgment in the smoky haze. He walked toward the table, his steps measured and unhurried. He stopped beside Jedediah. "Let the lady go," Eli said. His voice was still quiet, but it had a new edge to it, like the ring of hard steel. Jedediah looked up. His eyes narrowed. He saw a dusty cowboy. "Nothing special. This ain't your concern. Friend, go back to your corner." "I will not ask again," Eli said, his calm face a chilling contrast to the threat coiled in his voice. For a moment, Jedediah hesitated, something in the cowboy's unblinking gaze giving him pause. But pride and whiskey were a potent combination. He laughed, a short, ugly bark. "Or what? You gonna make me?" Eli did not answer with words. His hand moved, not toward his gun, but in a blur of motion too fast to follow. He grabbed Jedediah's own hand, the one that was crushing Clara's wrist. He applied pressure with his thumb to a point just below the knuckles. There was a sickening crack of bone. Jedediah screamed, a high, strangled sound, his hand flying open as he released Clara. She scrambled back, stumbling against a table, her heart hammering against her ribs. The mule skinner, cradling his broken hand, kicked his chair back and lunged at Eli, his face contorted with rage and pain. The fight was as short as it was brutal. It was not a barroom brawl. It was a methodical dismantling. Eli moved with a grim efficiency, sidestepping Jedediah's wild swing and striking him once in the throat with the heel of his hand, as Jedediah gagged, clutching at his neck. Eli drove a fist into his stomach, doubling him over. He finished it with a single, precise punch to the jaw. Jedediah's eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed to the floor in a heap, unconscious. Silence descended on the gilded cage. Jedediah's friends, who had been laughing moments before, now stared at their boots, suddenly sober. The other patrons looked away, wanting no part of this. Eli Cutter stood over the fallen man for a second, his chest rising and falling evenly. There was no triumph on his face, only a weary disgust. He looked at the saloon owner, Silas Blackwood, a man with a cold smile and colder eyes, who had been watching the whole affair from behind the bar. Their eyes met for a long, silent moment, an unspoken challenge passing between them. Then, without another word, Eli turned. He walked back to his table, placed a few more coins down to cover any damages, and strode out of the saloon, leaving the silence and the stink of fear behind him. He did not look back. That night, the moon was a sliver in a black, star-pocked sky. The wind whispered through the dusty street, carrying secrets and sorrows. Clara could not sleep. The echo of that bone-snapping crack and the sight of Jedediah's crumpled form played over and over in her mind. No one had ever stood for her before. Men took from her, used her, hurt her, but no one had ever defended her. The act was so foreign it felt like a threat in itself. She had to know why. She had to say something. Slipping out the back of the saloon, she wrapped a thin shawl around her shoulders against the desert chill. She knew where he was staying. Redemption Gulch was not big enough for a man to stay hidden. The rented shack was little more than a shed at the edge of town, leaning as if tired of standing. A low light glowed from its single window. She approached cautiously, her feet making no sound in the thick dust. She saw his silhouette through the window. He was just sitting at a small table, cleaning his gun, his movements deliberate and focused. She took a breath, her courage failing her, and almost turned to leave, but the memory of his quiet voice gave her strength. She knocked softly on the doorframe. Eli looked up, his hand never pausing in its work. He was not surprised to see her. He had been half expecting it. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble. Clara hugged her shawl tighter. She stood in the doorway, afraid to come closer. I came to thank you," she stammered, the words feeling clumsy in her mouth. "For what you did not have to—" Eli finished reassembling the cylinder of his Colt and laid it on the table. He finally looked at her, his gaze direct and unsettling. A man ought not to put his hands on a woman like that. It was a simple statement of fact. Nothing more. "He will not forget it," Clara said, her voice trembling. "Mr. Blackwood will not forget it. You have caused trouble for me." She did not mean it as an accusation, but as a warning, a truth of her world. Kindness had consequences, and she was always the one who paid the price. Eli only nodded, his face giving nothing away. "You should go back inside. Ma'am, it is not safe out here." Fear coiled in her stomach. He was right. Every moment she stood there was a risk. "Thank you," she whispered again, a useless, inadequate word. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod and tipped an imaginary hat. It was a gesture of dismissal. She understood. He had done what he felt he had to do, and now the transaction was complete. He wanted nothing from her. He wanted to be left alone. She turned and melted back into the darkness, the brief, strange encounter leaving her more unsettled than before. Later, much later, when the town was sunk in a drunken sleep, the screaming started. It came from the back rooms of the Gilded Cage, where Silas Blackwood lived and ruled. It was not the loud, defiant scream of a fight, but the muffled, pleading cries of someone who knew resistance was futile. In his shack, Eli Cutter heard them. He sat bolt upright on his cot, every muscle tense. He recognized Clara's voice, thin and desperate, punctuated by the dull thud of fists against flesh and the sharp, cruel crack of a belt. His hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. He could picture it perfectly. Silas, his face a mask of cold fury, punishing her for the trouble she had caused, for the disruption to his business, for the challenge to his authority that Eli had laid at his feet. A fire burned in Eli's gut, a hot, familiar rage he had spent years trying to bury. He wanted to storm over there, kick the door down, and drag Silas Blackwood into the street. But he did not move. He sat in the darkness, listening, and his stillness was not born of indifference, but of a cold, hard calculation. If he went now, Blackwood would kill him, or the sheriff, who was in Blackwood's pocket, would arrest him, and Clara, Blackwood would finish what he started, and there would be no one left to stop him. He knew men like Silas. They broke their toys and then threw them away. So he waited. He sat in the dark and listened to the sounds of her pain until they faded into whimpers, and then into a terrible, final silence. He did not sleep. He sat and waited for the dawn, and the rage inside him cooled into something much harder and more dangerous, a purpose. The first hint of light was a pale gray line on the eastern horizon, smudging the edges of the black sky. Eli was already moving. He saddled his horse, a sturdy buckskin that had carried him 1,000 miles, and tied a small bedroll and his supplies behind the cantle. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who knew exactly what he had to do. He walked not to the front of the saloon, but to the filthy alley that ran behind it. The stench of refuse and stale beer hung in the air, and there, beside a pile of broken crates and empty bottles, was a bundle of rags. As he drew closer, he saw it was Clara. Silas had thrown her out like garbage. She was curled on her side, half conscious, her dress torn and her face a swollen, bloody mess. One eye was puffed shut, and a deep gash split her lip. Her breathing was shallow, a pained little hitch in her chest with every inhale. She was a broken thing in a world that had no use for anything that was not whole. Eli knelt beside her, his movements slow and deliberate so as not to startle her. He gently brushed a strand of matted hair from her face. Her one good eye fluttered open, struggling to focus on him. Fear, raw and absolute, filled it. She tried to flinch away, a reflexive motion of a creature that knew only pain from a man's touch. "It is all right," he said softly, his voice a stark contrast to the violence that had been visited upon her. "I am not going to hurt you." Tears welled in her eye, mixing with the blood on her cheek. She coughed, a wet, rattling sound, and winced in agony. Her lips, cracked and bleeding, moved, forming words that came out as a ragged whisper, a final, desperate confession. "I'm not used to gentle—" The words struck Eli harder than any fist. They were the sum of her life, the bleak truth of her existence. He looked at her broken form, at the spirit that had been so relentlessly crushed, and the last of his carefully constructed walls crumbled. He had tried to stay out of it. He had tried to just ride on. But the world did not always let a man do that. He leaned closer, his voice so quiet it was little more than a breath in the cold morning air, a promise made not to her, but to the barren landscape and the coming sun. "Then I'll teach you how forever feels." With a tenderness that belied his rough appearance, he slid his arms beneath her, one under her shoulders, the other under her knees. She weighed next to nothing. She gave a small, pained sigh, and her head lolled against his chest, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion. He stood, holding her as if she were made of spun glass, and carried her out of the alley. He walked to his horse, which stood waiting patiently. With practiced ease, he mounted, settling Clara in front of him, her head resting against his shoulder. He wrapped one arm securely around her waist, holding her close. She was barely conscious, a warm, fragile weight against him. He urged the horse forward, walking it slowly through the sleeping, dusty streets of Redemption Gulch. No one saw them go. As they cleared the last of the ramshackle buildings, the sun broke over the eastern hills, painting the desert in strokes of brilliant gold and rose. The light washed over them, a baptism of fire and hope. Eli Cutter did not look back at the town he was leaving behind. He looked forward, toward the vast, empty horizon, a broken woman in his arms and a promise to keep. The world beyond Redemption Gulch was vast and empty, a silent, sprawling canvas of pale earth and paler sky. Eli's ranch was not so much a place as it was a foothold against this emptiness. It was nestled in a shallow valley, protected from the worst of the wind by a low ridge of sun-bleached rock. There was a small, sturdy cabin built of cottonwood logs chinked with mud, a lean-to for the horses, and a corral holding a handful of stubborn-looking cattle that watched their arrival with bovine indifference. A lone windmill creaked a mournful, rhythmic song over a deep-bored well, its blades turning slowly in the ceaseless wind. It was a place of profound silence, broken only by that creaking metal, the lowing of livestock, and the dry rustle of the wind through the sagebrush. Clara was barely conscious for the long ride. She drifted in and out of a painful haze, aware only of the steady warmth of the man holding her and the rhythmic gait of the horse beneath them. When they finally arrived, Eli dismounted with a fluid motion, lifting her down as if she weighed no more than a sack of flour. He carried her inside the cabin. The interior was as sparse and functional as the man himself. There was a stone hearth, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a narrow cot in one corner, and a small pantry stocked with tins and sacks of dry goods. Everything was clean, ordered, and worn with use. There were no decorations, no softness, nothing that spoke of comfort or a life beyond simple survival. He laid her gently on the cot, which was little more than a wooden frame with a thin mattress stuffed with straw. It was the first time she had lain on something soft that was not offered with a price attached, and the simple fact of it made her want to weep. But the tears would not come. She felt as hollowed out as a dead tree. He said nothing about her injuries. He fetched a basin of cool water from the well and a clean rag. With an impersonal, almost clinical touch, he began to clean the blood and grime from her face. Every time his fingers came near, her whole body went rigid. She flinched, a violent, uncontrollable shudder, her breath catching in her throat. She was an animal cowering in a trap, waiting for the final blow. But it never came. His touch was firm but gentle, his movements slow and predictable. He cleaned the gash on her lip, his expression unreadable, and then he simply stood up and placed the basin on the table. "The well is 50 yards from the door," he said, his voice quiet in the small space. "Food is in there." He gestured with his chin toward the pantry. He took a thick woolen blanket from a chest at the foot of his own bedroll, which he had laid out on the floor, and placed it over her. "Rest." With that, he walked out of the cabin, leaving the door slightly ajar. Clara listened to his footsteps fade as he went to tend to his horse. He did not ask her name. He did not ask what had happened, though the story was written in blood on her face. He did not ask for thanks. He demanded nothing. This absence of expectation was so alien it was terrifying. She lay there, wrapped in the blanket that smelled of dust and clean wool. And for the first time in more than a decade, she was alone without being afraid of who might walk through the door. The exhaustion finally claimed her, and she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The days that followed passed in an uneasy quiet. Clara's bruises began to fade from angry purple to a sickly yellow-green. She moved about the cabin like a wraith, skittish and silent. The slightest unexpected noise, a floorboard creaking, a door shutting in the wind, the jingle of his spurs, would make her jump, her hand flying to her throat. She kept her eyes on the floor, avoiding his gaze, making herself as small and unnoticeable as possible. This was how she had survived, by becoming invisible. Eli seemed to understand this. He gave her space, a commodity she had never known. He never entered the cabin without making some noise first, a soft cough or the deliberate scuff of his boots on the porch, giving her warning of his approach. He spoke little, and when he did, it was about practical things. "The gray cow needs milking. There is a tear in the fence by the south pasture. We are low on firewood." He never told her to do these things. He simply stated them as facts, It was up to her to act. At first, she was too afraid to do anything, convinced it was a test she was meant to fail. But the silence stretched on, and the need to do something, anything, to earn her keep began to gnaw at her. She could not bear the weight of his charity. Her first attempt at milking the cow was a disaster. The animal was cantankerous and swatted her with its tail, kicking over the bucket twice. Clara, near tears with frustration and humiliation, expected to hear a man's angry shout, to feel the sting of a slap for her clumsiness. Instead, Eli simply walked over, picked up the bucket, and positioned the three-legged stool again. Without a word, he guided her hands, showing her the firm, rhythmic motion. His hands were large and calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. When she finally got the hang of it, a thin stream of warm milk hissing into the pail. He just nodded and walked away. She began to work. She was clumsy, her body unaccustomed to labor that was not born of fear. She learned to patch a fence, her hands soft and easily blistered. But she did not stop. She learned to chop firewood, the axe heavy and awkward in her grip. She learned to cook meals on the small cast-iron stove, simple stews and cornbread that filled the cabin with a warm, unfamiliar scent. She worked with a quiet, desperate determination, trying to build a wall of usefulness around herself, a reason for him to let her stay. Each evening, she would watch him eat the food she had prepared, her stomach in knots, waiting for the complaint or the sneer that was sure to come. But he always just ate in silence and gave a small, appreciative nod when he was finished. His patience was a constant, unnerving presence. It began to chip away at the ice that had encased her heart for so long. He treated her not as a woman, and certainly not as property, but simply as another living creature deserving of its own space. He was like the land around them, steady, silent, and demanding nothing but that you endure. He was teaching her a new language, one where kindness was not a prelude to a demand, and where silence was not a threat, but a comfort. The nights were the hardest. The profound silence of the plains would be broken by the yipping and howling of coyotes. The sound was a lonely, predatory cry that echoed the emptiness inside her. On the first night she heard it, she curled into a tight ball on her cot, pulling the blanket over her head, her body trembling with a primal fear. The howls sounded like the laughter of cruel men in a dark room. She heard movement outside, peeking through a crack in the cabin wall. She saw Eli. He had built a small fire a short distance from the cabin door. He sat on an old stump, a rifle resting across his knees, staring out into the impenetrable darkness where the sounds came from. He was not looking at the cabin. He was watching the perimeter, a silent, solitary guardian. He sat there all night. The next morning, when she brought him a tin cup of coffee, her hands shook so badly she nearly spilled it. "Thank you," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the ground between them. He took the cup, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting second. "For what?" "For last night, the coyotes." He took a sip of the coffee and shrugged, his eyes on the horizon. "Just keeping the wolves off, Miss—" She knew he did not just mean the four-legged kind. He had been guarding her, and the simple, unspoken acknowledgement of her fear was a greater comfort than any words could have been. He did it the next night, and the night after that. He would sit by his fire until the first light of dawn broke, a steady, unmovable presence between her and the things that hunted in the dark. Word of their arrangement, as it was bound to, eventually trickled back to Redemption Gulch. A lone cowboy living with a fallen woman from the Gilded Cage was a scandal too juicy for the gossips to ignore. The story grew with each telling, twisted into something sordid and indecent. It was only a matter of time before that talk found its way back to the ranch. It arrived in the form of Sheriff Bartholomew Miller. He rode up one afternoon on a fat, placid gelding, his tin star pinned crookedly to his dusty vest. He was a man who preferred the path of least resistance, and his face was set in a weary, apologetic expression. Eli saw him coming from a mile off and met him at the corral. Clara, who had been hanging laundry on a line stretched between the cabin and a stunted tree, froze where she stood, her heart seizing with panic. A man with a badge meant only one thing: trouble. She scurried back inside the cabin, watching through the window, her hands clenched in the fabric of her apron. "Eli," the sheriff said, not dismounting. He shifted his weight in the saddle. "Been some talk in town." Eli leaned against the corral fence, his arms crossed over his chest. He did not say a word, just waited, his face as still as stone. "It's about the woman," Sheriff Miller continued, looking uncomfortable. "The one from Blackwood's place. Folks are saying it ain't proper, her being out here with you. Silas Blackwood is kicking up a fuss, too. Says she ran out on a debt." Eli's eyes, which had been fixed on the distant hills, slowly moved to meet the sheriff's. There was a cold light in them now. "She does not owe him anything." "That may be so," the sheriff sighed, wiping a sleeve across his sweaty brow. "But you know how it is. A woman like that, she attracts trouble. It might be best for everyone if you just send her back before things get ugly." The suggestion hung in the dry air between them, thick and poisonous. Clara, watching from the window, felt the floor drop out from beneath her. Send her back. The words were a death sentence. She would be returned to Blackwood, to the beatings, to the endless cycle of shame and pain. Only this time it would be worse. So much worse, for having dared to escape. Her breath came in ragged gasps. She had known it was too good to last. Eli's posture did not change, but a subtle tension radiated from him, a dangerous energy that even the sheriff's dull horse seemed to sense. His voice, when he finally spoke, was dangerously low, each word chipped from ice. "She ain't property." Sheriff Miller flinched as if struck. The 3 words were a flat rejection of everything he had implied, a line drawn in the dust that he did not dare cross. He saw the look in Eli's eyes, not hot anger, but a cold, settled certainty that was far more intimidating. This was not a man you could push. "Now, Eli, I ain't saying she is," the sheriff stammered, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "I'm just saying, for her own good." "Her own good is for you to ride back to town and tell Silas Blackwood to leave her be," Eli interrupted, his voice cutting and final. "Tell him if he comes out here, he will not be riding back." The threat was unmistakable. Sheriff Miller's face paled. He had seen Eli Cutter fight. He had no desire to see what the man would do when he was truly provoked. He pulled on his reins, turning his horse. "All right, Eli, have it your way," he muttered. "But do not say I did not warn you." He spurred his horse and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and unresolved tension in his wake. Eli stood watching until the sheriff was just a speck on the horizon. He then turned and walked back toward the cabin. Clara shrank back from the window, her heart pounding. He had defended her. He had stood up to the law and to the whole town for her. He had called her something other than property. The enormity of it was staggering. That evening, a tense silence filled the small cabin. Clara served him his dinner of beans and salt pork, her hands trembling so badly she could barely hold the plate. He ate, as always, without a word. The air was thick with things unsaid. She had to ask. She had to understand. After he had finished, as he sat cleaning his rifle by the light of a kerosene lamp, she finally found her voice. It was small and shaky, like a newborn colt trying to stand. "Why?" Eli stopped his work, his hand stilling on the barrel of the gun. He did not look up. "Why what?" "Why did you help me?" she asked, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Back in town, and today, with the sheriff, you do not know me. I am nothing but trouble. You should have left me in that alley. You should have sent me back." He was silent for a long time, the only sound the soft hiss of the lamp. He set the rifle down carefully on the table and finally lifted his head. his eyes meeting hers across the small room. The calm mask was gone. For the first time, she saw what lay beneath it, a deep, aching pain that mirrored her own. She saw a man who was not just weathered by the sun, but haunted by ghosts she could not see. His voice was raw, scraped clean of any pretense. "Because I know what it's like to be trapped." He looked away then, out the dark window at his own reflection. But the word had been spoken. It was not a grand declaration or a promise. It was something far more powerful, a shared wound. In that moment, he was no longer a stranger, a savior, or a silent protector. He was just a man, shaped by his own loss and his own guilt, who had looked at her and seen a reflection of his own cage. And in that shared darkness, a fragile, tentative flicker of understanding was born. His words, "Because I know what it's like to be trapped," did not just hang in the air. They settled into the silence of the cabin like fine dust, coating every surface. They were the truest words that had ever been spoken between them, a bridge built across the chasm of their separate pains. Clara had no reply. She simply nodded, a small, jerky movement, and retreated to her cot, pulling the blanket up to her chin. But she did not sleep. She lay in the dark, listening to the sound of his breathing, turning his confession over and over in her mind. It was the key to a door she had never known existed. Across the room, Eli sat in the darkness long after the lamp had been extinguished. He stared at the faint rectangle of the window, but he was not seeing the moonless night. He was seeing another time, another life, the memories, which he kept locked away in a lightless corner of his soul, had been disturbed. They came now, unbidden, as sharp and clear as if it were yesterday. He saw her face, Sarah. Her hair was the color of autumn leaves, and her eyes held the warm, steady light of a campfire. She had a laugh that could make wildflowers grow in barren soil. He remembered the feel of her hand in his, the way she would lean her head against his shoulder as they sat on the porch of the small homestead they had built with their own two hands. It had not been a ranch like this one, a fortress against the world. It had been a home filled with light and hope. And then he saw his son, Samuel, a boy of 5, with his mother's bright eyes and a shock of unruly blonde hair. He remembered the weight of the boy on his shoulders, the small hands clutching his collar as they pretended his horse was a mighty steed, charging into battle. He remembered the boy's questions, an endless stream of them about the sky, the coyotes, the stars. He had had an answer for everything. The memory shifted then, turning dark and cold. It was the day he had left them in town to board the stagecoach. They were going to visit Sarah's sister in the next county, a 2-day journey. He was meant to go with them, but one of the horses had thrown a shoe and a calf had taken sick. "You stay, Eli," Sarah had said, her hand on his cheek. "The ranch needs you. We will be fine. It is only 2 days." He could still feel the phantom warmth of her touch, the finality in her smile. He had held Samuel up to the stagecoach window, the boy's face pressed against the glass, waving until the coach was nothing more than a dust cloud on the horizon. He never saw them alive again. The official story was a robbery gone wrong. A gang of road agents, hungry and desperate, had stopped the coach in a narrow canyon pass. There was a strongbox, but it was nearly empty. The passengers had little of value. Something had spooked them. Shots were fired. When the posse found the coach hours later, it was a scene of senseless slaughter. The driver, the guard, and all 3 passengers inside, Sarah, holding Samuel in her arms as if she could shield him from the bullets with her own body. Eli had been the one to identify them. He remembered standing over their bodies, a strange, hollow ringing in his ears. The world had gone silent. There was no grief, no rage, just a vast, deafening emptiness. He had lived in that silence ever since. He'd sold the homestead, unable to bear the ghosts that walked its halls. He had spent years riding the trails, his face to the wind, working himself to the bone from sunup to sundown, trying to outrun the memory. He took jobs that were hard and dangerous, hoping for a stray bullet or a fall from a horse to finish what the robbers had started. But death, it seemed, did not want him. He had hunted for the men responsible. He'd followed rumors and cold trails across 3 territories, his heart a cold, hard stone in his chest. But he never found them. They had vanished like smoke, and over the years, the rage he felt for them had slowly, poisonously, turned inward. He had not been there. He had let them go alone. He had chosen a lame horse and a sick calf over his own family. He had survived, and that was the crime for which he could never forgive himself. He was trapped in that day. In that moment, he had watched the stagecoach disappear, and he knew he would be trapped there for the rest of his life. In the days that followed his confession, the quiet between him and Clara changed. It was no longer the uneasy silence of strangers, but a more comfortable quiet, freighted with unspoken understanding. They began to talk, not in long conversations, but in small, hesitant exchanges, like 2 people learning a new and delicate language. One afternoon, as she was helping him stack firewood, a splinter drove deep into the palm of her hand. She gasped, dropping the log, her face pale, in the gilded cage. Such an injury would have earned her a curse for her clumsiness. She instinctively tried to hide her hand, but Eli had seen. "Hold still," he said, his voice low. He took her hand in his. She flinched, but did not pull away. His grip was firm, yet incredibly gentle. He led her to the cabin and had her sit, then fetched his knife and a pair of tweezers from his saddlebag. With the patience of a watchmaker, he worked the sliver of wood from her flesh. When it was out, he cleaned the small wound with whiskey. It stung, and she winced, before wrapping a clean strip of cloth around her palm. Throughout it all, he did not speak, but his hands did. They spoke of care, of a tenderness she had never known. Later that week, she found the courage to speak of her own past. He was sitting on the porch, mending a bridle, his hands busy. She sat on the steps nearby, darning one of his worn shirts. "I had a family once," she said, her voice so quiet it was almost carried away by the wind. Eli did not look up from his work, giving her the space to continue without the pressure of his gaze. "My mother and father died of a fever when I was 15, she said, her fingers tightening on the needle. "I went to live with my uncle. My mother's brother—" She paused, the memory a bitter taste in her mouth. "He was a good man. I thought he was kind to me. For a year." The needle stopped moving. "When I turned 16, he told me we were taking a trip to a new town for a new start. He said he had found work for me. He sold me to Silas Blackwood for $50 and a lame horse." Eli's hands went still. The leather strap he was mending fell to the porch. He slowly looked at her, and the raw pain in his eyes was a reflection of her own. "He told me I was lucky," Clara continued, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. A story told so many times in the silence of her own mind that it had lost its power to make her cry. "He said a girl like me had to earn her way. Blackwood. He taught me what that meant. He and the others, they taught me that kindness was a lure for a trap, that words like a love were just noises men made when they wanted something, a lie you tell to get what you want before you show your true face. After a while, you learn to stop hoping for anything else. You learn to be grateful for the silence between the beatings." She fell silent, her story told. He did not offer empty platitudes. He did not say he was sorry. He simply reached out and gently took the half-mended shirt from her hands, which were now trembling too much to hold the needle. His touch was a silent acknowledgement, an acceptance of her truth. In that moment, they were no longer just a man and a woman, a cowboy and a saloon girl. They were 2 survivors, adrift in the same unforgiving sea, their pasts the anchors that threatened to pull them under. Trust, they learned, was not built with words but with small, steady actions. It was in the way he began leaving a bucket of fresh, cool water for her on the porch each morning so she would not have to walk to the well first thing. It was in the way she started mending his clothes without being asked, her stitches small and neat, a quiet act of care. He once came back from a long day riding the fence line, his hands raw and bleeding from the barbed wire. Without a word, she took the tin of salve he kept and tended to his cuts, her touch as light as a moth's wing. These were the things that mattered. They were the slow, patient process of rebuilding a world on the ruins of the old one. The land around them was a constant mirror of their struggle. The dust was relentless, a fine silt that found its way into everything, a gritty reminder of decay. The fences were always in need of mending, a constant battle against the forces that sought to break things down. And the storms came out of nowhere, sudden and violent, turning the sky a bruised purple and unleashing a fury that seemed bent on scouring the world clean. One night, such a storm rolled in. It began with a low rumble in the distance, a threat whispered on the wind. Within an hour, the sky was a churning mass of black clouds. The wind shrieked like a banshee, tearing at the roof of the cabin and rattling the door in its frame. Rain came down in blinding sheets, turning the hard-packed earth into a slick, running river of mud. Clara sat by the hearth, her arms wrapped around her knees, watching the fire flicker. Eli stood by the window, staring out into the tempest. Suddenly, a flash of lightning illuminated the entire valley in a ghastly, blue-white light, followed an instant later by a crack of thunder so loud it shook the very foundations of the cabin. "The horses!" Eli yelled over the roar of the storm. The lightning had struck an old, dead cottonwood tree not 20 feet from the lean-to where the animals were sheltered. The tree had exploded into splinters, and the lean-to itself was groaning, its roof threatening to collapse. The 2 horses inside were screaming in terror, their eyes wide with panic. Without a second of hesitation, Eli grabbed his coat and plunged out into the storm. Clara was right behind him. The rain hit her like a physical blow, soaking her to the skin in an instant. The wind tore at her hair and clothes, trying to push her back. Mud sucked at her boots, making every step a struggle. They fought their way to the lean-to. Eli worked on the gate, its wood swollen and jammed shut from the rain, while Clara tried to soothe the terrified animals with her voice. "Easy now, easy," she shouted, her words swallowed by the gale. Another flash of lightning lit the scene, and she saw the raw fear on Eli's face as he threw his shoulder against the gate. It finally splintered open. He lunged inside. Grabbing the reins of the buckskin, the horse reared, its hooves lashing out, but Eli held on, his voice a low, calming rumble, even amidst the chaos. He led the animal out into the deluge. "Take him to the corral," he yelled to Clara. "The posts are deep. It will hold." She took the reins, the leather slick in her hands. The buckskin fought her, pulling against her, but she held on with all her strength, her feet sliding in the mud as she guided the panicked horse toward the relative safety of the main corral. Just as she secured the gate, she turned to see Eli emerging from the collapsing lean-to with the second horse. At that moment, with a great groan of tortured timber, the roof of the lean-to caved in. He had gotten out just in time. Together, they worked to calm the horses, their bodies moving in a frantic but unspoken unison. They were no longer 2 separate people, but a single unit, fighting against the elemental rage of the sky. When it was over, and the horses were safe, the storm began to recede as quickly as it had arrived. The wind died down to a mournful whisper, and the rain softened to a steady, rhythmic drumming. They stood in the middle of the corral, drenched to the bone, streaked with mud, and utterly exhausted. Their breath came in ragged clouds in the newly chilled air. Clara was shivering, a deep, uncontrollable tremor that shook her entire body. The wet dress clung to her, offering no warmth. Eli looked at her, and in the faint, emerging moonlight, he saw not the hardened saloon girl or the timid survivor, but just a woman, cold and spent. He moved toward her, his own exhaustion etched on his face. Without a word, He took off his heavy canvas coat, which was soaked through but still held some of his body heat. He wrapped it around her shoulders, pulling it closed in the front. It was huge on her, enveloping her in the scent of rain, leather, and him. His hands lingered on the collar of the coat. She looked up at him. Their faces were inches apart. The raw, wordless longing that had been simmering between them for weeks finally boiled over, filling the silence. His eyes, dark and intense, asked a question he would never dare speak. He did not move closer. He just waited, giving her the choice, giving her the power she had never had. Her hand, trembling, came up and touched his face. His beard was rough beneath her fingertips. It was a hesitant, questioning touch. She saw the storm in his eyes, a tempest of grief and loneliness that mirrored her own. And in that moment, all the fear, all the warnings her past had screamed at her, fell silent. She leaned in and kissed him. It was not a kiss of passion, but of desperation and discovery. Her lips were cold and trembling against his. For a second, he remained perfectly still, as if he could not believe it was real. And then he responded. He did not take, he did not demand. He simply met her kiss with a tenderness that shattered the last of her defenses. It was a kiss that tasted of rain and sorrow and a desperate, fragile hope. It was as if the world could break apart around them and it would not matter, as long as they were anchored to each other. When they finally broke apart, they just stood there, foreheads resting against each other, the rain dripping from their hair. The world had been washed clean. That night, back in the cabin, he built up the fire until it blazed, casting dancing shadows on the walls. They shed their wet clothes, leaving them to steam by the hearth, and wrapped themselves in dry blankets. He sat on the floor, his back against the wall, and she sat beside him, curled under the heavy wool of his coat. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, holding her close. There was no passion, only a profound and desperate need for warmth, for comfort, for the simple, undeniable proof that they were not alone. For the first time since she was a little girl, Clara May fell asleep in the arms of another, and for the first time in her life, she was not afraid. The quiet that had settled over Eli Cutter's ranch was a fragile thing, as thin and easily torn as a spider's web. In the weeks after the storm, a delicate trust had taken root between him and Clara, nurtured by shared work and unspoken understanding. They had found a rhythm, a way of existing side by side that felt almost like peace. But peace, in that hard country, was a debt that always came due. Word travels fast in a place where there is little else to do but talk. Sheriff Miller's reluctant retreat from the ranch had not gone unnoticed, and the story he carried back to Redemption Gulch was like a spark on dry tinder. The whispers that had been confined to the corners of the gilded cage now spilled out into the dusty street. The town, in its boredom and its harsh, simple morality, had found a villain and a victim, and they were eager to see the drama play out. Silas Blackwood fanned the flames with relish. He was a man whose pride was as vast and as brittle as a salt flat. Eli Cutter had not only taken what Blackwood considered his property, but he had humiliated him in his own saloon. The sheriff's inaction was the final insult. Blackwood stalked the length of his bar, his face a thunderous mask, pouring drinks for sympathetic ears and painting a picture of a decent, law-abiding business owner wronged by a violent drifter and a faithless woman. "She owes me," he would snarl, slamming a bottle down on the bar. 2 years of room and board, clothes on her back, and she repays me by running off with the first gunslinger who wanders into town. Is that justice? He conveniently omitted the part about the beatings, the fear, and the $50 he had paid her uncle. In his version of the story, he was the aggrieved party. He claimed she had stolen money from his strongbox, a lie that gave his grievance the weight of a crime. He fed the town's prejudice, its deep-seated suspicion of outsiders and its rigid condemnation of women like Clara. It did not take long for public opinion to harden against the pair hiding out on the edge of nowhere. The townsfolk, led by the wives of the church committee, began to put pressure on Sheriff Miller. It was indecent. It was a blight on their community. Something had to be done. Sheriff Bartholomew Miller was not a brave man, but he was a man who wanted to keep his job. He found himself caught between his fear of Eli Cutter's cold resolve and the rising tide of civic outrage. In the end, the pressure from the many outweighed the threat from the one. With Blackwood at his elbow, waving a fabricated list of Clara's debts and stolen goods, the sheriff reluctantly drew up a warrant. It was a flimsy document based on hearsay and lies, but it bore the seal of the law. It was enough. Clara saw them coming first. She was feeding the chickens, scattering grain from her apron. When she saw the dust cloud on the horizon, it was not the small, solitary plume of a lone rider. It was bigger, denser. Her blood ran cold. She stood frozen, one hand clutching the rough fabric of her apron. As the dust resolved into 3 figures on horseback, she recognized the sheriff's fat gelding at once. Beside him was the unmistakable, ramrod-straight posture of Silas Blackwood, and a third man she knew as one of Blackwood's cronies from the saloon. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. It was happening. Her past had found her. The fragile peace she had so cautiously allowed herself to feel was a lie, a cruel trick of the light. She was not safe. She had never been safe. She was a curse, a walking pestilence, and she had brought her sickness right to Eli's door. She dropped the grain and ran, not toward the cabin, but away from it. Her only thought was to flee, to draw them away from him, to disappear back into the wilderness where she belonged. If they found her alone, perhaps they would leave him be. It was the only thing she could do for him, the only way she could repay the kindness he had shown her. She would run, and she would let her past swallow her whole. She had not made it 10 yards before Eli's voice cut through her terror, sharp and commanding. "Clara!" He had been in the corral, tightening a loose post, and had seen the riders at the same moment she had. He was already moving toward the cabin, his face a grim, unreadable mask. He reached the porch just as she scrambled onto it, her eyes wild with fear. "They are here for me," she gasped, her voice choked with sobs. "I have to go. Eli, you have to let me go. I have brought this on you. It is my fault." She tried to push past him, to get inside the cabin, to grab the few meager belongings she owned and run out the back, into the hills, anywhere. But he blocked her way. He put his hands on her shoulders, his grip firm, anchoring her to the spot. "Look at me," he said, his voice low but intense. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face, shame and fear making it impossible to meet his eyes. "I cannot. Please, just let me go. He will ruin you because of me." "Look at me," he repeated, each word deliberate. He gave her a gentle shake. Slowly, hesitantly, she lifted her head. His eyes were not angry. They were steady, filled with a resolve that was as solid and unyielding as the rock of the canyon walls. "You are not leaving again," he said quietly, his gaze holding hers, not alone. The simple finality of his words broke through her panic. He was not sending her away. He was not blaming her. He was standing with her. The realization was so overwhelming that her legs threatened to buckle. He held her steady. The 3 riders had reached the rickety gate that marked the edge of his property. They stopped there, a grim tableau against the harsh afternoon sun. The sheriff, looking deeply uncomfortable, cleared his throat. "Eli Cutter," he called out, his voice thin in the vast open space. "I have a warrant here for the woman, Clara May. I am here to take her back to town." Eli did not release his hold on Clara. He kept his hands on her shoulders, a silent gesture of possession and protection. He turned his head and called back, his voice calm but carrying with effortless authority. "You are not taking anyone. Bartholomew—" Silas Blackwood spurred his horse forward, his face contorted in a sneer. "She is a thief! Cut her!"
She belongs to me until her debt is paid. The law says so. Now send her out before we come in and get her."
"This is my property, Blackwood," Eli replied, his voice dropping to a dangerously cold register. "You are not welcome here. Turn around and ride out." The sheriff held up the paper, which fluttered in the wind. "Eli, do not make this difficult. I have a warrant. I have to enforce it. If you interfere, I will have to arrest you for obstruction of justice." Eli slowly released Clara, giving her a gentle push toward the cabin door. "Go inside," he murmured. She hesitated, her eyes wide with terror. "Go," he said again, more firmly this time. She obeyed, stumbling into the cabin but immediately rushing to the window, her knuckles white as she gripped the frame. Eli walked down the 3 steps of the porch and stood in the open yard, his body positioned between the riders and the cabin. He did not draw his weapon, but his hand came to rest naturally on the worn leather grip of the Colt holstered at his hip. He was a solitary, unmovable figure against the vast, indifferent landscape. "That piece of paper is based on a lie, and you know it." "Sheriff," Eli said, his voice even, "Clara May has committed no crime, and she owes this man nothing." "That is for a judge to decide," the sheriff insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "My job is just to bring her in. Your job is to know the difference between the law and a rich man's grudge." Eli shot back. "You have made your choice. Now I am making mine. You will leave this ranch. Now." The air grew thick with tension. It was a classic Western standoff, a tableau of dust, sweat, and the unspoken promise of violence. The sheriff's hand twitched, moving toward his own gun. Blackwood's crony, a man with shifty eyes and a nervous grin, drew his pistol with a flourish. Blackwood himself watched Eli, his eyes glittering with hate, his own hand hovering over his holster. "This is your last chance." "Cutter," the sheriff said, his voice strained. "Stand aside." Eli did not move. He did not speak. He simply stood his ground, his gaze locked on the sheriff, a silent challenge that was more potent than any threat. The world seemed to shrink to the 50 yards of sun-baked dirt that separated them. A bead of sweat trickled down the sheriff's temple. His finger tightened on the trigger of his gun. It was in that moment, when the world was holding its breath and death was only a heartbeat away, that the cabin door flew open. Clara ran out onto the porch, her face pale and streaked with tears, her hair coming loose from its pins. "Stop!" she screamed, her voice raw and desperate, a sound of pure anguish. "Please do not do this! Stop it!" All eyes turned to her. The tension broke, punctured by the sheer force of her desperation. She stood there, trembling, one hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes pleading. She was not the invisible saloon girl anymore, nor the timid creature hiding from the world. She was a woman pushed past her breaking point, finding her voice in the face of unimaginable horror. She was begging not just for Eli's life, but for an end to a cycle of violence that had consumed her own. The sheriff stared at her, and for the first time, he seemed to truly see her. He saw not the fallen woman of town gossip, not the piece of property Blackwood claimed, but a terrified human being, pushed into a corner by a world that had shown her no mercy. A flicker of something, shame, perhaps, or a long-buried remnant of decency, crossed his face. He looked at Eli, standing resolute and ready to die for her. He looked at Blackwood, his face alight with cruel anticipation, and he looked at his own hand, holding a gun he was about to use to enforce a rich man's lie. With a heavy sigh, Sheriff Bartholomew Miller slowly, deliberately, lowered his gun and eased it back into its holster. "To hell with this," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. He turned his gaze on Blackwood, his expression one of weary disgust. "This is not worth dying for. Silas, it is over." Blackwood's face went from triumph to disbelief, then to pure, unadulterated fury. "Over?" he spat, his voice shaking with rage. "You yellow-bellied coward! You are the law! Are you going to let him get away with this?" I am looking the other way, the sheriff said, his voice flat. He gathered his reins, refusing to look at Eli or Clara again. This is between you and him now. The law wants no part of it. He turned his horse and, without another word, began the long ride back to town. His crony, after a moment of confused hesitation, holstered his own weapon and followed. Silas Blackwood was left alone, facing Eli across the yard. His face was a mask of livid hatred. He stared at Eli. Then his gaze shifted to Clara, who was now weeping openly on the porch. "This is not over, Cutter," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "The law might be blind, but I am not. I will have what is mine. You will pay for this, both of you." He wheeled his horse around so violently that the animal whinnied in protest and galloped off, kicking up a furious cloud of dust that hung in the air long after he was gone. Silence descended, heavy and suffocating. The immediate danger had passed, but the threat lingered, uglier and more personal than before. Eli stood for a long moment, watching the dust settle, his body still coiled with tension. The fight had been avoided, but the war had just been declared. He finally let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding, and the rigid line of his shoulders slumped, just a little. He was shaken, not by the fear of the gunfight, but by the grim certainty of what was now to come. Blackwood would not use the law next time. He turned and walked back to the cabin. Clara was huddled on the top step, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with violent, racking sobs. He sat down beside her, the wood groaning under his weight. He did not touch her at first, just sat there, his presence a silent comfort. "It is my fault," she cried, her voice muffled by her hands. "All my fault. I have brought this to you. Danger, death. You should have let me run." She blamed herself, saw herself as the root of all this trouble, a poison that corrupted everything it touched. All the years of being told she was worthless, a troublemaker, a source of sin, it all came pouring out in a torrent of guilt and self-loathing. Eli listened until her sobs began to subside into ragged, exhausted gasps. Then he reached out and gently pulled her hands away from her face. He held them in his own. "This is not your fault, Clara," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "This is his fault. It is the fault of men like him, and towns that let them fester." "But he will come back," she whispered, her eyes wide with a new, more potent fear. "You hurt him. He will come back to hurt you." "Yes," Eli said, his expression grim. "He will." He looked away, toward the horizon where a new bank of dark clouds was gathering, the sky bruised and angry. A low, distant rumble of thunder rolled across the plains. It was not the cleansing roar of the storm they had weathered together, but a low, ominous warning, a promise of a different kind of violence. He looked back at her tear-streaked, terrified face. He held her gaze, and a sad, weary understanding passed between them. He pulled her closer, his arm wrapping around her trembling shoulders, holding her against his side. "You said you brought me danger," he said softly, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "Maybe that is true." He paused, his gaze fixed on the darkening sky. "But maybe danger's the only thing that makes life worth something." She leaned into him, clinging to his strength as the first roll of thunder echoed again, closer this time. They sat together on the porch, two scarred souls in the path of a gathering storm, finding in their shared peril a reason to hold on. The uneasy peace held for 4 days, 4 days of pale sunrises and quiet evenings, of shared meals and the slow, steady work of mending a broken world. It was a fragile truce with fate, and on the 5th day, the truce was broken. Eli had ridden out to the west pasture just after dawn. A section of fence had been brought down by a stray steer, and it needed mending before the rest of the small herd decided to wander off into the endless expanse of the plains. The air was cool and still, the sky a vast, empty bowl of blue. He worked with the steady, practiced rhythm of a man who found comfort in labor. The scrape of the shovel and the whine of wire twisting around wood, the only sounds in the silence. He thought of Clara, back at the cabin, likely kneading dough for the day's bread. A small, unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest. It felt dangerously like contentment. He never saw them coming. They did not approach from the direction of the town, but circled around from the north, using the low, rocky ridges as cover. There were 3 of them. Silas Blackwood, his face a tight mask of vengeful purpose, and 2 hard-faced men Eli had never seen before. They were hired guns, their eyes as empty and cold as a snake's, their clothes dusty from a long ride. They did not ride for pride or principle. They rode for coin. They tethered their horses in a dry wash a quarter-mile from the cabin and approached on foot, their boots making no sound in the soft dirt. Clara was outside, shaking a rug over the porch railing, her back to them. The sun was warm on her arms, and for a fleeting moment, she felt the simple joy of it. The clang of a dropped bucket by the well was the only warning she had. She turned, her heart lurching into her throat. Blackwood stood there, not 20 feet away, a cruel smile twisting his lips. His 2 companions fanned out on either side of him, their hands resting on their holsters. The peace of the morning shattered into a million sharp pieces. "Did you miss me, Clara?" Blackwood asked, his voice soft and menacing. Fear, cold and familiar, tried to paralyze her, but something else rose to meet it. Rage. This man would not take this from her. He would not drag her back into the darkness. She opened her mouth to scream, a warning to Eli, a cry of defiance to the empty sky. Before the sound could escape, one of the hired guns was on her, a big grimy hand clamping over her mouth, cutting off her breath. She fought. She was not the cowed, beaten creature he had last seen in the gilded cage. She kicked and writhed, her heels drumming against his shins. She bit down on his hand, her teeth sinking deep into the fleshy part of his palm. He roared in pain and surprise, slapping her hard across the face. The blow sent her reeling, stars exploding behind her eyes. But she did not stop. She screamed, a raw, ragged sound, and clawed at his face, her nails seeking his eyes. "Get her under control," Blackwood barked, his calm facade cracking. The second gunman moved in, grabbing her arms and twisting them painfully behind her back. Together, they wrestled her into submission, her strength no match for theirs. They bound her hands with a length of rope and shoved a foul-smelling rag into her mouth, silencing her cries. "The barn," Blackwood said, his eyes glittering with a feverish light. "A man like Cutter values his stock. Let's leave him a message." He struck a match, the small flame a tiny spark of pure malice in the bright morning sun. He tossed it onto a pile of dry hay just inside the barn door. The fire caught instantly, a hungry whoosh as the flames devoured the tinder dry wood and straw. Black smoke began to billow from the entrance, thick and oily. They dragged the struggling Clara toward their horses. She fought every step of the way, a wild, desperate animal. But it was hopeless. They threw her across the saddle of one of the horses and tied her down like a sack of grain. As they rode away, she looked back at the ranch, at the small cabin that had been her sanctuary, and saw the column of black smoke climbing into the pristine blue sky. A funeral pyre for the life she had just begun to believe was possible. From the west pasture, Eli saw it first as a dark smudge against the horizon. He paused, his hand on a fence post, a cold knot of dread forming in his stomach. It was too thick for a cook fire. It was in the wrong place. It was coming from his ranch. He dropped his tools and sprinted to his horse, his heart hammering against his ribs. He vaulted into the saddle and dug his heels into the buckskin's flanks, pushing the animal into a dead run. The wind whipped at his face, but he did not feel it. His world had narrowed to that rising column of smoke and the terrible, gut-wrenching fear of what he would find when he got there. He rode like a man possessed, his mind a maelstrom of fire and heartbreak. He saw the flames before he was even halfway there, angry orange tongues licking at the sky. He saw the barn, his small, sturdy barn, fully engulfed, its roof collapsing in a shower of sparks and embers. He did not care about the barn. He did not care about the cattle scattering in panic or the tools that were his livelihood. He cared about one thing.
Clara!
He roared, his voice torn from his throat as he galloped into the yard. He leaped from his horse before it had even skidded to a halt and ran to the cabin. The door was ajar, swinging on one hinge. He burst inside. The room was empty. A half-finished loaf of bread sat on the table, covered with a cloth. A tin cup lay on its side on the floor, but she was gone. He ran back outside, his eyes scanning the ground, desperation clawing at him. He saw the tracks, 3 sets of boots, the signs of a struggle. A small, discarded piece of a blue dress, snagged on a sagebrush, and the hoofprints of 3 horses, heading east, toward Redemption Gulch. A sound that was half a sob and half a snarl escaped his lips. The quiet, patient man who had nursed her back to health, who had guarded her through the night, was gone. In his place was something cold and elemental, a force of nature as unstoppable as a flash flood. He remounted his horse, his face carved from stone, his eyes full of a fire that burned hotter than the flames consuming his barn. He turned the buckskin toward town and rode, not like the wind, but like the bullet that follows the thunder. In Redemption Gulch, the town was treated to a spectacle. Blackwood and his men dragged Clara down the main street. They had taken the gag from her mouth, but her spirit was not broken. She hurled curses at them, her voice hoarse, her eyes blazing with a hatred that startled the onlookers. They pulled her from the horse in front of the Gilded Cage saloon and, with brutal efficiency, tied her to the thick wooden post that supported the porch roof. A crowd gathered, drawn by the commotion. They stared, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and cruel satisfaction. Here was the saloon girl, the fallen woman, getting her just desserts. Women who had whispered about her behind their hands now stood in the open, their expressions hard with judgment. Men who had once paid for her company now laughed and jeered, their taunts like stones.
Look at her now, one man shouted. Not so proud, are you?
Thought you could run from what you are, a woman in a church bonnet called out, her voice shrill with righteousness. Clara held her head high, refusing to let them see her cry. She met their gazes one by one, her defiance a shield against their scorn. She was bleeding from a cut on her cheek. Her dress was torn, and her hair was a wild tangle. But she would not break. Not in front of them. Silas Blackwood stood on the saloon steps, basking in the attention. He was no longer just a saloon owner. He was the town's avenger, the enforcer of its cruel morality. He held up a hand for silence.
This is what happens to thieves,
he proclaimed, his voice ringing with self-importance.
This is what happens to women who forget their place. She thought she could hide behind a gunslinger, but there is no hiding from justice.
He disappeared into the saloon for a moment and emerged holding a long, black leather whip. The crowd murmured, a wave of anticipation passing through them. This was more than they had expected. Blackwood coiled the whip in his hand, its tip flicking against the dusty boards of the porch. He walked down the steps and stood before Clara, his eyes full of a triumphant, ugly light. You are going to learn a lesson you will not forget, he sneered, his face close to hers. You belong to me, and I always collect what is mine. He stepped back, raising the whip high over his shoulder, the long leather tail slithering in the dust behind him. The crowd held its breath. Clara closed her eyes, bracing herself for the searing pain that was to come. A single, sharp sound cut through the silence. It was the thunder of a horse's hooves, ridden hard and fast, every head turned toward the end of the street. A lone rider was coming, a specter emerging from the heat haze and dust. He was bent low over his horse's neck, a figure of pure, relentless velocity. It was Eli. He did not slow as he entered the town. He rode straight into the crowd, which scattered like chickens before a hawk. He pulled his horse to a rearing halt, not 10 feet from the porch, the animal's hooves pawing at the air. He was already holding his Colt, its barrel a black, unblinking eye. Blackwood stood frozen, the whip still raised, his face a comical mask of shock and fury. His 2 hired guns, who had been laughing on the porch, scrambled for their weapons. The world exploded into a chaos of dust, smoke, and screaming. The first gunman was fast, but Eli was faster. A single shot rang out, and the man spun around, a look of stunned surprise on his face, before collapsing in a heap. The second gunman, more cautious, ducked behind one of the porch posts and fired, his shot going wide, splintering the sign of the barbershop across the street. Eli swung down from his horse. Using the animal for cover, the air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder. People were screaming, running for cover, diving into doorways. Another shot from the porch kicked up dust near Eli's feet. He moved, a fluid shadow, and fired twice. The first shot shattered the post the gunman was hiding behind. The second found its mark. The man cried out, clutching his chest, and toppled backward through the bat-wing doors of the saloon. 2 down. A searing pain suddenly erupted in Eli's left shoulder. He grunted, stumbling, as he saw Blackwood lowering a small derringer he had pulled from his vest. The bullet had torn through flesh and muscle, and a hot, wet slick of blood was already spreading down his sleeve. He ignored it. The pain was a distant thing, a distraction. He raised his Colt, his arms screaming in protest, his sights finding Silas Blackwood. Blackwood stood there, his face pale, the whip forgotten in the dust at his feet. The derringer was empty. He was defenseless. But even in the face of death, his arrogance did not desert him. He looked from Eli's cold, determined face to Clara, who was staring in wide-eyed horror, and he sneered, his final words dripping with venom. "Women like her can't be saved." Eli's face did not change. His eyes, cold as a winter grave, were locked on Blackwood's. He did not say a word. He simply squeezed the trigger. The shot was deafening in the sudden silence. Silas Blackwood was thrown backward as if struck by an invisible fist, a dark stain blossoming on the white of his shirt. He hit the wall of the saloon and slid to the porch, leaving a grim smear behind him. He lay still. Silence. The entire town of Redemption Gulch stood frozen. The dust began to settle. The only sound was the ragged, pained breathing of Eli Cutter. Clara, her eyes fixed on him, finally found her voice. "Eli!" He turned to look at her, the strength that had sustained him through the rage and the gunfight finally deserting him. His face was ashen, his legs buckled, and he collapsed to his knees, his gun falling from his numb fingers into the dust. Freed by some forgotten Samaritan in the crowd, Clara ran to him. She fell to her knees in front of him, her hands hovering over the bloody mess of his shoulder, afraid to touch him. Tears she had refused to shed for herself now flowed freely, coursing through the grime on her cheeks. "Don't leave me," she sobbed, her voice breaking. "Eli, please, do not leave me." He looked up at her, his vision blurring at the edges. A faint, sad smile touched his cracked lips. He had promised to teach her gentle, but the world had only taught them violence. He had made her another promise, too, that first morning in the alley, a promise born of his own unending grief. He raised his good hand, his fingers brushing her tear-stained cheek. His voice was a faint, raspy whisper, for her ears alone. "Now you know what forever feels like." He slumped forward, his consciousness fading, his head coming to rest against her shoulder. She held him, her arms wrapped around him, pressing her hands to his wound as if she could hold his life inside him with her own will. The townsfolk stood watching, their mockery and judgment replaced by a stunned, horrified silence. They had been spectators at a cheap drama, and it had suddenly become terribly, irrevocably real. The silence was heavy, thick with the weight of their own complicity, a judgment far harsher than any court could deliver. In the ringing silence that followed the final gunshot, the town of Redemption Gulch held its breath. The living stood like statues of salt, their faces masks of shock and fear, while the dead lay as grim punctuation marks in the dust. For a long, stretched moment, the only movement was the slow, crimson creep of blood into the thirsty earth and the trembling of Clara's hands as she held Eli. It was the town doctor, a man named Josiah Finch, who broke the spell. He was old, his hands spotted with age, but his eyes were clear and pragmatic. He had seen more than his share of gunshot wounds. Pushing through the paralyzed crowd, he knelt beside Clara, his medical bag thumping softly in the dust.
"Let me see, child,"
he said, his voice a low, calming rumble. Clara looked up at him, her eyes wild with a fierce, protective terror. She did not want to let go, as if her touch alone was keeping Eli tethered to the world. "You have to save him," she pleaded, her voice a raw whisper. "I will do what I can," Josiah said, gently but firmly prying her hands away from the wound. "But we need to get him out of this street." Getting Eli back to the ranch was an ordeal born of desperation. The sheriff, his face a pasty gray, offered the use of his office, but Clara refused, shaking her head vehemently. He could not heal here, not in this town that had condemned them, that had gathered to watch her humiliation. He needed the silence. He needed home. Josiah, seeing the iron resolve in her eyes, did not argue. With the help of a grizzled old prospector who owed allegiance to no one but his mule, they loaded Eli into the back of a buckboard wagon. The doctor gave Clara laudanum for the pain and a stern list of instructions for cleaning the wound and fighting the fever he knew was coming. "He will likely lose the use of that arm, if he lives," Josiah said, his words stark and unsparing. "The bullet tore through the muscle and nicked the bone. The real fight will be against the infection. Keep him clean, keep him hydrated, and pray. It is in God's hands now." But Clara knew it was in hers. For weeks, the small cabin became a battleground, the enemy an invisible fever that burned through Eli's body, leaving him drenched in sweat and shivering with chills. She nursed him with a devotion that was primal. The woman who had once flinched at every shadow now moved with a quiet, tireless purpose. Her hands, which had once trembled with fear as she poured whiskey for drunken men, were now steady as she bathed his feverish skin, changed his bandages, and spooned thin broth between his cracked lips. He drifted in a delirium, a gray twilight world between life and death. He cried out in his sleep, his words fragmented and ghost-like. He spoke names that were not hers. "Sarah," he would murmur, his brow furrowed in anguish. "The boy, Samuel, I should have been there." Clara sat by his cot in the long, quiet hours of the night, listening to these broken pieces of his past. She did not feel jealousy, only a profound, aching sorrow. She began to understand the true depth of the cage he was trapped in. His silence was not a lack of feeling. It was a tomb where he had buried his heart. She was not just healing a gunshot wound. She was tending to the soul of a man who had forgiven himself for nothing. She would whisper back to the ghosts, her voice soft in the lamplight. "It is all right. Eli, I am here. You are not alone." While Clara fought for Eli's life in the silent isolation of the ranch, the town of Redemption Gulch fought over his legacy. Sheriff Miller, his conscience weighing on him like a shroud, made his official declaration. Silas Blackwood and his hired men had burned a man's property and kidnapped a woman with intent to do her harm. Eli Cutter had acted in defense of himself and another. The killings were ruled justifiable. The case was closed. But the law was one thing, gossip was another. The official story was too simple, too clean. The whispers in the general store and over clotheslines wove a different narrative. They painted Eli as a cold-blooded killer who had gunned down 3 men in the street. They painted Clara as a siren, a Jezebel who had lured 2 men to their deaths. They had become folk legends, but of the darkest kind. They were outcasts, their story a cautionary tale whispered to unruly children. When Eli's fever finally broke after 3 long weeks, he woke to a world of pain and weakness. He was a shadow of his former self, his broad shoulders gaunt, his left arm bound tightly to his chest, useless and stiff. He woke to the sight of Clara, asleep in a chair beside his cot, her face pale with exhaustion, her hands resting in her lap. He watched her for a long time, the steady rise and fall of her chest the most beautiful sight he had ever seen. He had ridden into hell for her, and she had pulled him back. Their recovery was slow and quiet, a mirror of the land itself. As Eli regained his strength, they began the arduous task of rebuilding. The barn was a heap of blackened timbers and ash. They spent days clearing the debris, their faces smudged with soot, their movements slow and deliberate. The work was punishing, but it was a necessary ritual. With every charred board they hauled away, they were clearing away a piece of the past. They had to go to town for supplies, for lumber, nails, and food. The first time Clara went alone, while Eli was still too weak to travel, was a trial by fire. As she walked down the main street, a hush fell over the town. Conversation stopped. People turned their backs. Women pulled their children close, as if she were a carrier of some terrible disease. At the mercantile, the clerk served her in cold, clipped silence, placing her goods on the counter and taking her money without ever meeting her eyes. She walked out with her head held high, her back straight, but inside, the old wounds burned. When she returned to the ranch, Eli saw the look on her face. He did not have to ask what had happened. "We could leave," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Sell this place. Go somewhere no one knows us." Clara looked at the foundation of the new barn they had begun to lay. She looked at the small, sturdy cabin that had been her first true home. She looked at him. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I am done running." And so they stayed. Together, they raised the new barn, beam by beam. Eli, with only one good arm, could not do the heavy lifting. He taught Clara how to saw a straight line, how to drive a nail true. She became his right hand, her body growing strong and lean from the labor. They worked in a comfortable rhythm, a partnership that needed few words. Their love was not in whispered sweet nothings, but in the shared weight of a heavy timber, in the passing of a hammer, in the cool cup of water she brought him when the sun was high and fierce. Their love deepened in the quiet moments between the work. It was in the evenings, when they would sit on the porch and watch the sky bleed into a tapestry of orange and purple. It was in the way she would instinctively help him with his shirt, her fingers brushing the scarred landscape of his shoulder. It was in the way his eyes would follow her, filled with a quiet reverence that spoke more than 1,000 poems. They were two broken halves of a whole, their jagged edges fitting together perfectly. They had been forged in violence and loss, and what emerged was something stronger than steel, an enduring, unspoken vow. One evening, months later, the frame of the new barn stood stark against the setting sun, a skeleton of promise. The air was soft and golden, the wind a gentle sigh. Eli was sitting on the porch steps, honing a knife with his good hand. Clara came and sat beside him, leaning her head against his good shoulder. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the light fade, a comfortable quiet that was more intimate than any conversation. She turned her head slightly, her cheek brushing against the rough fabric of his shirt. "You kept your word," she said, her voice soft as moth's wings. "You taught me gentle." He stopped his work, the knife still in his hand. He looked down at her, at the strength in her profile, at the quiet confidence that had replaced the fear in her eyes. He remembered the broken, terrified woman he had found in the alley, whispering those words through cracked lips. He remembered his own reckless promise. He reached up with his scarred hand and brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek, his touch feather-light. A small, Sad smile touched his lips. "Gentle don't mean soft, Clara," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It means strong enough to stay." Life on the ranch remained a struggle. The land did not soften because they had found each other. The sun was still a hammer in the summer, and the winters were still bone-achingly cold. Storms still came, tearing at their new roof with violent, shrieking winds. Cattle still sickened and died, and the desert wind never, ever rested. The world was as harsh and unforgiving as it had always been. But they were no longer alone in it. They endured. They faced the drought, the storms, and the silence of the world together. They were two scarred, solitary trees that had somehow grown together, their roots intertwined, their branches reaching for the same unforgiving sky, stronger together than they had ever been apart. The final image of them is etched not in memory, but in the dying light of a dusty western day. They are on horseback, riding side by side along the ridge of the valley. Eli sits tall in the saddle, his bad arm resting in a sling, his good hand loose on the reins. Clara rides beside him, her posture straight, her gaze fixed on the horizon ahead. The sun is sinking behind the distant mountains, painting the clouds in fiery streaks of crimson and gold. Their shadows stretch out long behind them, dark rivers flowing across the golden land, a testament to the pasts they could never outrun. But they are not looking back. They are riding forward, into the vast, uncertain twilight, their presence a quiet, defiant answer to a cruel world. They are proof that love, even a love that is born of ashes and broken to pieces, can still be fierce enough and strong enough to last forever. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love to hear where you are tuning in from in the comments below to connect with fellow listeners. Please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts.